The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand. We gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise to get what we want. We got to organize.
Welcome to the Pantsula Podcast, presented by the All African People's Revolutionary Party. We're part of the Kaji Circle, Work Study Circle. My name's Evan, and here's my comrade Jamilah. Our objective is Pan-Africanism, which we define as the total liberation of the African continent under scientific socialism. And as Pan-Africanists, we always want to honor the ancestors of today. For this episode, which is about capitalism and color revolutions, we're going to honor Gloria, Richardson, and Baba Abdusshahid Luqman, who both transitioned recently.
Baba Luqman, wow, yeah, that definitely hit a lot of us revolutionaries and organizers hard. I think the work that Baba Luqman did was important because he never failed to let everyone know he came from the streets and he's doing that work for the streets. He was part of the masses and he understood the contradictions he faced and he worked through those contradictions. Just being part of the Black Alliance for Peace Network, being part of the Black Power Media Network, doing the work with his partner Jackie. I just remember one of the last things they did was a program talking about how homophobia, transphobia has no place in the African Revolution. And that was a huge thing. And that came out of a program they did the night before. And the program that Baba Luqman did, which was focused on men in African communities and working through a lot of the contradictions and issues that happen there to create a positive environment for men, for masculine or centered people. And there was a guest on there that was pretty anti-trans. And so they came on the next day and did that episode. And I think that is a testament to the work that Jackie and Baba Luqman did and Jackie continues to do. I really just commend them. And, you know, they're being older. I mean, I'm a little younger than them, not too much younger, but you know, people talk about how, oh, if you're older, you can't change your ways, you're set in your ways. Or they're older folks in the revolutionary community, and they have an understanding that if we are going to be liberated as a people, that means including all African people, and that means that we need to understand, work through our contradictions to create a better world for all African people. And I just think that it's really important we honor folks like Baba Luqman who are doing that work. And that hit us pretty hard. And that was somebody who we worked with directly, the Black Alliance for Peace, and also, you know, watching the work they did through their podcasts, etc. So that was, yeah. So Gloria Richardson is another person who, you know, I mean, you can talk about her, but that sister was powerful.
If you're familiar with Gloria Richardson, you might remember the picture of her pushing away, a couple pictures of her pushing away a rifle from the National Guardsman. She's way more than, not pretty couple awesome pictures, but she's part of SNCC. She did some Freedom Rise. She's part of SNCC. If you want to know more context for that photo, that's during the Cambridge Rights movement in 1963. And she's also exceptionally militant activist. So at the point, even those like Martin Luther King, John Lewis, like, oh, you gotta chill. But you know, come on, like people, like Africans have faced so much. So if people want to be extra militant, then they have every right to do so. And that's something that we should always remember, that people see what they're facing as Africans in different ways, and it's okay to be militant. It's okay to say just like step lines, and Comrade Jamil was talking about Luqman, that people that people coming from different backgrounds, so people react different ways. They do things in the struggle that, yeah, it might make some of you uncomfortable, but you understand, as long as you're fighting the same fight, yeah, you're good. So I think that's one thing that's important.
Absolutely. This revolution, if we're going to have a mass revolution, there's going to be people of various classes, but the point is that your class interests are for the people. It doesn't matter if you come from a working class background, lumpen proletariat. It doesn't matter as long as your focus is on liberation of the people. And I think we saw that with the example of Gloria Richardson and Baba Luqman. You know, a lot of people like, oh, the revolution, you know, oh, it's just people sitting in their ivory tower, this and that, and just discussing what it looks like. No, you have people day to day doing the work. And there's just two examples of that happening. So this whole idea of this class division, no, when it comes to the liberation and love of the people, it doesn't matter. Your class interests are for the people. And are you for the people's struggle or not? That's what's important. So, and that's what ultimately this episode is about. Are you for the people's struggle or not? And I know we're talking about color revolutions, but essentially, if you are for a color revolution or a counter revolution, essentially is what it is, or are you for the people's struggle and the people's revolution? One or the other. You got two choices. I hope you pick the right one.
Definitely. Yeah. Like as we'll talk more about it, yeah, you have to understand every case. There are various class interests, there are various national interests, gender interests, so on. That it's not enough to just see a protest and say, oh, we're rooting them on. Oh yes, like take on the power. Like I think like if you think about, I know we respect it a lot, but if you think of, for example, January 6th, like, is that something you want to root on? Like, if you're rooting it on, then hopefully we're going to change your mind about some of the things you think. But but otherwise, again, just because there is unrest, protest, something is happening, or militant action of some kind, doesn't mean that it's necessary to support. So, and since we're talking about color revolutions, you might hear that term. So color revolutions, they tend to be nonviolent, or like the stress is on nonviolent action. So it can make up occupations, marches, strikes, boycotts, some other maybe some like internet spread or social media spread of some kind, and they tend to be horizontal, or at least they have the appearance of being horizontal. Sometimes, like as we'll get more detail, there might be what is called AstroTurf. So AstroTurf means that an event that is supposed to be grassroots or like from the people turns out it's sponsored by some NGO or some party apparatus or something else that's like really directed at strings from above, and it's not really something from a group of people. And since it's color revolutions, it tends to be some kind of color or something that sort of unifies it. You think of like saffron revolution, the purple revolution, white revolution, cedar revolution, blah blah blah. Nike Jordan's revolution. I don't know, something. So there's always something that's unifies it, that makes it like easy to grasp. And these tend to happen either like the most often like the greatest circumstance for these is typically during either a closely fought election or an election other ways where there's a leader, so like there's an authoritarian leader of some kind that they're either like shaving votes or shaving votes or doing some kind of nefarious being, and sort of fighting against that. And it's not just elections; it could be after assassination. It could be some general degradation of material social conditions. It could be some like major trial or some other like murder or something like that. And you often hear like some of the same terms. Oh, we want democracy. We want freedom. We want human rights. We want to fight corruption. We want to make sure people have social justice and so on and so forth. And it's understandable. Like with people, you hear that people are fighting for freedom, they're fighting for democracy, they're fighting for human rights. It's like, I'm for that. Like obviously there'll be some people who aren't for those. So, and that's still a story. But again, for the most part, people are like, I'm for people who, if they're wronged, they should get some justice for what they are. So, and it's a little tricky as far as when the whole color revolution started. It's a little tricky as far as when you consider color revolution. Like, I think from what I've seen, that color revolutions have tended to be, the use of color revolutions has tended to happen after the Cold War. Like, if you read about Cold War, it was for people who have the global south. It was far from cold, but that's another episode. But it tends to relate to Eastern European or Central Asia or like North Africa. Like it's mainly like Eastern Europe, Central Asia, like former Eastern Bloc, former Soviet nations who after the overthrow of the system, like were rushed straight into capitalism, and some of the ruling class took big time advantage of it and decided to, let me just have my own dictatorship or like control over things. And even though we're going to talk about a couple of revolutions in states that are run by anti-imperialist or socialist nations, like some color revolutions are in states where the economy is anything, where the people running it are anything are far from socialists. So, but it's still a case, like, it's use of revolution in a way where there's no sort of overturning the class. It's just a matter of, we want this person out. We just want this party out of power. And the social conditions are changing in a very ephemeral manner, a very basic, temporary manner. So again, that's basically a revolution that at best it leads to just a slightly better version of what's happened before, or at worst, it's a full-blown counter coup. So,
yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about how democracy is perceived, for instance, in the snakes or in Europe versus how democracy is enacted in other parts of the world, because you mentioned lack of hierarchy in a way, or a horizontal structure. When you talk about horizontal structures or people not getting lifted as leaders, because obviously they're taking tips from governments or places around the world which have enacted more socialist structures. So in order to conceal what the actual objective is from said organizations like the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, or the CIA, so they totally get people, like what's happening in the situation with Cuba, getting people from Miami to go over to Cuba and have protests. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but let's talk more about how from these acronymed organizations, how they create this illusion of a horizontal structure or a lack of hierarchy based on the histories of mass organizing in these countries that they want the coups to exist in.
I think one aspect to follow along what you're talking about is that people don't have a full idea of what democracy is. That they think that what you have, what you see in front of you, I vote for a representative, I vote for a bill, I vote for some amendment, and there's democracy. And if I don't like them, I could vote for someone else or something later on, or I could do a little protest. And I think that's democracy. And I think a lot of that is the effectiveness of the various aspects of propaganda, the corporate media, our educational system. Both of those play a huge role to provide a shawl of what democracy is. That anything else is a dictatorship or authoritarianism or autocracy or a monarchy. And I think another aspect of that is not only limiting what democracy is, but also attaching democracy to capitalism and thinking that if you have both of those, that one leads to the other. If you have a democracy, it's capitalist, or if you have capitalism, it's democracy. We're understanding that in itself is a bit of that both if you understand both the history of capitalism and even the history of democracy, that's not quite true, and some of it is a propagandistic idea to assert that both of these are one and the same. So, and especially in Hand of the Snakes, there's not only the aspect of propaganda in that respect, but also that they make it seem as though that anything outside of the United States is somehow less than, or it's like, or the person like, oh, the United States, they have poor healthcare. We're the best country in the world. We should have better healthcare, or like people dying less and more race than we should be. And anything that looks different is not scary. They have the people who assert that the Scandinavian nations are socialist, or they still think Russia is a communist nation, even though you can't have a communist nation that's a oxymoron, and two, the political economy of Russia is anything but is far from socialist. By any means, Putin is not socialist. So, but again, I think a lot of it is not a lack of understanding of how deeply the public relations market is on us.
I want to discuss land analysis with this, as well as gender and race analysis. How much of that connection do you think is tied to gender, land, and race? Because if you look at the documents, the Declaration of Independence, for instance, it literally speaks against the masses organizing. We talked in the last episode about how the primary benefactors of the freedom would be the landowners. So every document was written so as to prevent mass organizing. And that meant Africans who were enslaved, who fought for their freedom and gained freedom by their own hands, to women, to people who were working class, poor, lumpen proletariat. So with the situations you're seeing with the current color revolutions, what's the connection between land, gender, and race in these situations?
I think the major thing is one thing that I've noticed, especially in certain cases, is that one thing you might notice if you look more carefully at the color revolution, especially in cases where there is a racial aspect to it, that they'll tend. Obviously, it's not generally the case every single time, but you'll often see that there is a sort of an anti-people's element to it. There's a and they tend to be of the favored or like more like the favorite nationality, or they tend to be not always, but tends to be male, tends to be of a, if not bourgeois, but certainly petty bourgeois point of view. That, and I think that's plays a major role. And because if you see in some like imperial nations that a lot of times when there is a protest about they're doing they're falling for political correctness, or they're doing some kind of SJWs, like, or some kind of race theory, there is like a tends to be like, obviously it's not, again, it's not exclusively petty bourgeois European men, but it tends to be a favor for that point of view, or like that domination, or even in cases where there's no like European aspect to a revolution. It is certainly a class and gender aspect where there is a favor for the time between capitalist patriarchy and those who own the most of the land, of the resources, or they have the greatest ownership of resources and land and so on. I think that's a big aspect to it.
Yes, and not to mention that the Haitian Revolution was the first of its kind in this part of the hemisphere. And, there was Louisiana, there were parts of this country where, people had to end up going to Haiti to seek freedom, because you're African, you come to Haiti, where, we liberated ourselves. So I think that situation should be acknowledged as well. Haiti is still being made to pay for the fact that they freed themselves. And why would Haiti have to pay reparations for the slave masters, for the landowners, because they fought back for their liberation? Like, that literally makes no sense, but it only makes sense in the context that we see now. You did what? You want us to give you to give you back the, no, I don't. So it's looking at the context. You really have to understand why these color revolutions occur. Like, no, like, you don't want to deal with the US dollar? Excuse me? Okay, weapons of mass destruction. Okay, like, you don't want to deal with the IMF, the World Bank? Oh, really? You don't want to deal with Belgium? You don't want to, excuse me? So you had the torture and assassination of Patrice Lumumba. You had the torture and assassination of Muammar Gaddafi. Even in this country, we already know what happened to Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. So not only do you need to have race, class, land, and gender analysis, but you need to understand that this is an ideological struggle we're having. We're at ideological war. So it's not to just be like, well, you just have to pay us back or whatever. It's just like, people are building an ideological structure to wage war against the system. And we cannot have that. So all of these things need to be combined. And so, of course, a color or counter-revolution is a huge component of that ideological war on the people.
Yeah, there's definitely an ideological war there especially when you see stuff happening in Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. That, like, one thing with color revolutions is that they said that even though there may be material conditions that are getting worse, whether from some of the internal contradictions in the system there, or from sanctions or agents who are doing stuff for it. It's understandable that there aren't going to be people who are saying, "Yo, this fake stuff has to change." The thing is with color revolutions is that, or what people point out with regards to that, is that those, you talk about these like alphabet agencies, organizations, so forth, that they don't really care. They don't really care about that. They only care for the fact that they want to have greater market penetration for capital, or they only care to the extent on monetary issues, like, oh, they're not using our money, or they're not following our advice. Boom. Like, if they have inflation, well, we'll use that inflation as a tool for propaganda. But as far as like actually doing anything about inflation, whatever. We'll still keep the embargo on. We'll still keep the blockades on. Let's do this. Just again, when people talk about color revolution, it's not saying that there's nothing wrong or there's nothing that can be changed. What they're saying is that there are forces that are there to take those, and like what happens within, like, if you're a militant within the United States, you understand about co-optation of movements, of marches, of groups, and so on. You understand that happens there abroad too. So again, it's just like, you always have to recognize those forces. So,
and getting back to the word democracy, it is funny that people who have fallen for the illusion of these color revolutions somehow think that democracy is defined the same around the world. So like, we're fighting for these countries that have democracy. You can recognize that actual democracy doesn't happen in this country, but somehow want the same type of system for people around the world. That makes sense. So I think particularly about somebody like Amir Thompson, or Brother Question, or Questlove, whatever he called himself. He put out a post on Instagram. I don't have Instagram, so of course I saw it because someone sent it. So he's posting about, well, someone I know is talking about how people were arrested because they had a copy of Thriller and they couldn't have Led Zeppelin hair and all of this. And I'm like, are you serious? You're really focused on that? Thriller came out in 1982, and anyone who knows me knows I love Michael Jackson, but we got to keep it real. Thriller came out in 1982. It wasn't even his best album. That's a whole other conversation. But Thriller came out in 1982. There's a blockade that exists where people are starving. You really are focused on the fact that somebody was jailed because they had a copy of Thriller and they couldn't wear a certain type of hair. Again, this is an ideological struggle. And so things coming out of the US and the West, there was a war against the Cuban masses. So as a result, is that a contradiction that exists? Sure. But you have to look at the conditions that exist. And being arrested because you have a copy of Thriller, I think there's bigger issues to think about. And there's people like Questlove, who's in, they redid Fight the Power, the Public Enemy song. And in that, so you have people like Nas, like a ton of people who have contradictions. People like Nas, you had Black Thought, you had Rhapsody, and others in I think even, was it YG, but isn't he colorist? But that's a whole another conversation. But Questlove is DJing, and in the background they have the red, black, and green flag, except it's the red, black, and green flag where it has the 50 stars and all that, whatever. But he's in the song, Fight the Power. And yet he understands the conditions that Africans face in this country, but cannot recognize the same policies enacted on Africans and working class people and marginalized and oppressed people and colonized people in this country. He has no understanding that those same policies are enacted around the world against colonized people. How can you not make that connection that US imperialism affects the whole world? And that is the problem. You're so connected to music that you can't even look past that to say, oh, wow, the blockade exists. There's these particular conditions. And maybe creating an understanding that maybe that's why somebody was arrested, because Thriller represented a particular piece of the West that was like, okay, yeah, that's like way too much. That's like capitalism times 200. And maybe that's what Thriller represented, because Michael Jackson was the biggest artist at that time. And let's get like, this is a capitalist society in the US. You don't think they marketed him under that system? So yeah, again, I love MJ, but we got to understand, like, there's certain things you got to do in order to fight capitalism. And that was one of the things, or the Led Zeppelin, or a lot of things. It's just like, look, we have these codes of conduct we got to deal with, and dealing with Thriller is just, that's whatever. So to die on that hill, to not support the revolution because somebody was arrested for having a copy of Thriller. Are you kidding me? So so of course, what I was told was that there were folks from the Estefan family that were on this post making comments. And it was the granddaughter of Gloria Estefan's father. So the grandfather of this person who posted was security for Batista. So is that really the hill that Questlove wants to die on? Like the Batista fascist government and people on your posts supporting that and coming from that legacy and being like, oh, we got to get rid of Diaz-Canel because of whatever reason. We have to stop the Cuban Revolution. We have to stop the Chavistas. We have to do that. Like, is that really the hill you want to die on? Like seeing what the masses of the people are up against Thriller. Like, come on. I just really wanted to say that, where a lot of these celebrities really, they want to take the side of justice, but they're not studying justice movements. They're not studying the people's struggle for liberation. They're not taking that time to do that study. So this is the same thing that we've seen when it comes to the Israel-Palestine issue. So people like free Palestine, and then, you know, their bosses are like, oh, I don't know, do you want your contract snatched away? And they're like, oh, I don't know enough about to say. Then don't speak on it. If you feel like, well, I don't know, I'm teetering on this side or that, on both sides, then don't speak on it until you are aware about the issue, because these are people's lives at stake. Don't speak on an issue of justice or injustice until you have some awareness about what that justice and injustice looks like and is. That's not the hill that any of these people should die on, and be like, you got arrested for Thriller. Like, get out of here. And again, I love MJ. I got the MJ tattoo and everything. Whatever. But I'm not out here trying to defend Thriller like that, or any Michael Jackson record, when it comes to the freedom, when it comes to the liberation struggle for the people around the world against U.S. imperialism. No. So I will throw away all my Michael Jackson records before I die on that hill. That's what I got to say to that.
Oh, one thing was reminded me of a Michael Parenti lecture. He's talking about methods of media manipulation, and one time he was listening to a radio news report about how in Cuba, for the first time, they get to celebrate Christmas, and yay, yeah, and in one part that Randy specifically noticed, like, it was like I forget what the quote was, but you can look up his lecture on YouTube, and he'll note. And then he said, "Oh, they brought out a Christmas tree or something like that, just like last year." Like, wait, whoa. And Randy's like, anyone gonna notice that? Like, hey, they've been celebrating Christmas this whole time. Oh, whoa, wow, this is a new story. But they noted that the anchors didn't say anything from the reporter. Didn't say anything about, wait, last year? Are you sure? Or again, it's that point where they want to present these things as if they're so unusual. And yeah, there might be some differences as far as cultural differences, and it's understandable. But at the same time, they present this view of nations as this, like, almost a dystopia. And speaking of which, I was watching Eyes of a Rainbow, the documentary of Asad Shakur, and even she, when she was liberated from prison and from exile in Cuba, even she was like, I didn't have this idea of, even I didn't have this idea of Cuba. I thought everyone was going to walk around looking like Fidel and fatigues and cigars, but and again, it points to how deeply people are accept these thoughts of what other nations are supposed to be like. That there's this idea of separation, that anything else outside, you even see this within the United States, the sort of divide of whether it's an urban and rural, or like north and south, or east and west and midwest. That this sort of idea to make it so that it's all so focused on what you are, this individualist, hyper individualist, consumerist idea, that to think anything outside of that is treacherous or antithetical to the order of the United States. So.
No, that's funny you said that. Speaking of, it was just Asada's born day, so we definitely want to wish Asada a happy 74th. And it's really funny you said that, because Common, or Lonnie Rashid Lynn, had a song on the album, like Water for Chocolate, Song for Asada. And who was all over that album? The Soulquarians. So Questlove was part of the Soulquarians crew. So for him to die on that hill of, well, somebody got arrested for Thriller, Asada is in Cuba right now. I hope he's aware of that. And I hope he is aware that the Obama administration put the highest bounty on Asada's head to be extradited back in the sticks. I hope he is aware of that. And Cuba's like, no, this is for the people's liberation. We ain't letting her go. This is for the people's liberation. I hope that Amir Thompson is aware of that. So how can you talk about freedom and this and Asada and not understand how US imperialist policy affects Cuba, affects Venezuela, affects Africa, affects the whole world? Because you're just like, well, this cultural war that exists, you're doing the same thing that neoliberals and right-wing people do, is focus on this cultural war as opposed to the ideological war and struggle that exists daily for colonized people around the world. I just really wanted to say that. When you said Asada, I was like, oh, wait, that a song for Asada, Soulquarians, Questlove, come on. Anyway, but we have to recognize it. And so what's been happening, and I'm sure you have experiences, just like every person who is doing this work has experience. People who are considered left-wing or liberal or Democrat or on the left of the right. Yeah, I'll just put it out. That's a very gross generalization, but I'm just putting it that way. So people are like, well, look what's happening in Cuba. They need help. There's a need of military intervention. Cuba has had a revolution since 1959, 1960. And the US has been trying to get at Cuba since that time. And because of the Cold War, because of all these other things, they used Elian Gonzalez's situation, where it's just like, oh, these families are fighting against this. They want him to be in Cuba. They want him to be in the US. I remember I was actually in Mexico when that was happening. I was like, oh my goodness. But look what happened. Elian Gonzalez is like, Viva la Revolución. So, you know, that the US lost that fight. So I don't want to get too into that situation, but study that situation. And so they tried to use sort of these sob stories to be like, see, there's a fight for a child. But the Obama administration, the Clinton administration was like, well, you know, we essentially kidnapped everything. I know they were like boarding on a plane and he's in Africa, but they essentially kidnapped him. I don't care what anybody says. But so people were fleeing because, oh, so we have Papa Doc, we have Baby Doc, Now, we have, and so Aristide, the people supported Aristide, he got snatched up. And it's just like, okay, so now people are fleeing. What did the US go? No, you got to go back. But this whole situation with Elian Gonzalez is like, oh man, this is a culture war. Again, utilizing culture war. But what people don't understand is really an ideological war against the revolution. And as you were saying, yeah, there are contradictions that exist in everything. Everything has a positive or a negative. We have to look at everything dialectically. And in this ideological struggle, to not look at the positives that outweigh whatever situation that is happening based on the work that the revolution did. Yeah, people are hungry, but did you stop to think it's because of a blockade that exists? Did you stop to think it's because of the countries that were trading with Cuba were told, if you do trade with Cuba, then we're gonna stop loans to you? Did people ever stop to think that there are situations that exist because of the US policy of this blockade or embargo, or there are various names to it. It's called El Bloqueo in Cuba, so the blockade. But the people really stop. Like, if you can understand the situation that's happening in this country, you have to understand that the US doesn't shift based on this country or that country. The US is just like, I'm a narcissist, and I don't care if people go hungry. If I don't get what I want, then everybody else is gonna go down. I mean, that's literally what the US is doing. So to not understand that these color revolutions are based on that narcissism, and it's like, well, we'll create this scenario and we'll create this false empathy because people are struggling. And so people understand that. People understand what it's like to struggle. So, we'll create this scenario where people are struggling in one way or another. But we just don't let them know that we have a particular objective. And that's the thing, if people do not study the history of these struggles in colonized areas around the world, struggles that fought against imperialism, places like Cuba around the world, places like Venezuela, places like Vietnam, Haiti, because we're going to get into that. But people need to understand this history and the revolutions and why the US has a vested interest in stopping these revolutions. To say that we need somebody who's a liberal or in the left of right wing to say, well, I don't think it's a bad idea that there would be US military intervention. People are starving. There's sanctions that happen in this country. And the US isn't doing anything about it. People are starving here. Houselessness is here. And so when people talk about, well, communism has killed 11 billions of people, it's just like, okay, so capitalism under US imperialism has killed billions of innocent people around the world. There's houselessness here. There's income inequities here. People are starving. I mean, there's lots of things that are happening here. And there are embargoes against people in this very country. And yet, you can see that. Because you're like, oh, the police are doing this to us. Oh, why is there racism in housing and whatever? But you can see that, but you cannot see what US imperialism is doing. Sometimes it's like, what? Like, what? And you have an understanding of it, but at the same time, you're just scratching your head. Because how can people not see it who claim to be on the left? They can see the injustice here, but want to support US military intervention against places that somehow have a communist party attached to them. Does that make sense to you? So because it says communist party, or you're not dealing with the IMF, or somehow, people are struggling, we need military intervention from the US. Like, just sit and think about when you support military intervention from the US, sit and think about what that means.
And as you point out, it's not like the U.S. is like imperialism. Even with regards to, it's not just not only a matter of whether it's a socialist party or communist party, but it could be a social democratic party. It could be it can even be like they did. Look what they did to Iraq and the Ba'ath Party. They're not by any means socialist or anything under Saddam. They're not anything like the Republic of Saudi was far from socialist or anything. But even then, they were still like, oh, you're nationalizing some oil fields. You're trying to use a different currency. Saddam, you're our boy. We helped y'all overthrow a communist party in the 60s. We helped you take care of Iran. We helped you against the Kurds in Turkey. Why are you doing it to us, Saddam? Come on, Saddam. What are you doing? And even so like that, not for any, and not to mention any nominal support for Palestine. Imperialism doesn't care. They don't care. They just want to make sure that your markets are open to us to get your cheap labor, to get your land, to get all your food, so feed us.
Hey, can we talk about the psyop that was the falling of the statue for a moment? There was an interview, it was from the BBC too, of all places, where there was a man who said, yeah, I was the person who helped topple the statue, but now I want Saddam back. It's like, oh, the government became worse after the US came in. Oh, who knew? So yeah, let's talk about that project.
Yeah, and I think that ties into what we're talking about with color revolutions, that there'll often be some kind of we talk about the issue of a color or some kind of flower or something that will represent the revolution, but also there'll be events like that, the toppling of the statue. They if you saw on the news, you think, oh, all these masses of people, they're coming out to take down Saddam. Let's take down Saddam. We're through with this. We're through with this autocracy. Blah blah blah. But there's a film by Metanoia. I think it's called C.I.A, and they talk about psychological operations. And one of the things they talk about was the toppling of the Saddam statue. That they noted that, for one, there weren't as many people in that square as you thought there were. You get a really close up as maybe 20, 30, maybe 100, maybe at most people there. And so it's to make it to make it look like Tahrir Square in Egypt during their thing, it's a totally different thing. And this is another thing about the Arab Spring, but we'll go into that. But again, they got the close up to make it seem as though it was a mass of people when it's a fairly small crowd. And two, it was done pretty much staged. It didn't occur naturally. It wasn't a group of people that came up to the statue and it's all we gotta take this down. It's just they're just waiting. Oh, let me get this. Oh, okay. Oh, no, go.
Even when the guy was talking about pulling down the statue, they put a US flag over Saddam's face on the statue. He said, no, I was offended by that. I put our flag over it. So even that, it was just they wanted you to know it was us who helped you topple this regime. And they were like, no, the people, what about us, the people? So that's pay attention to exactly what they're doing. It's no, we want to be your saviors. And it can never be the masses of the people who establish their own liberation and create the systems and governments that they want to see. It has to be this opposing oppressive force. It has to be an occupying force. And that occupying force tends to be the US, it tends to be Europe, it tends to be NATO, it tends to be situations like that. Look at what happened with Libya, where even Gaddafi was saying, well, you know, we have these forces coming in, we have like ISIL coming in, you know, we need to do something about that. And they were like, and then look what happened. He was like, well, I want to have a common African currency. Our people are being supported, free housing, all this. And it was like, excuse us? You have your systems backed in gold? I don't know. Okay. So yeah, they did something about it, I guess. And what happened? Africans were being enslaved. Jamilah was destabilized for all intents and purposes. The people's government was destabilized. And you had destruction. And so the people under the system are never able to decide their destinies. And that is the intent of this US imperialist system and other imperialist system. The people can never have self-determination, because if it's not in the people's interest to not nationalize the resources, it's not in the people's interest to trade with something or someone who has been deemed the enemy at some point in time, because it's like, well, we know you're going to steal from us, so why would we even make this deal with you? You know, as it said, throwing rocks and hiding your hands. That's exactly what the US does. So of course, you know, that's when in Venezuela, what did they do? Oh, we kidnapped Chavez, stalled the coup. And then most places around the world at this point, less and less places around the world do not even acknowledge Guaido. And why is US and Canada still acknowledging Guaido? Guaido was not democratically elected, but somehow the US is the arbiter of democracy. So we have to think about what's going on and recognize geopolitical aspects, recognize geopolitical history, understanding what's happening in the modern world geopolitically. But if we're just focused on culture wars or whatever, it's focused on, you know, where you're located, and you think that somehow it's just like gender. Somehow two genders is just natural because the West somehow has decided that. So it's the same thing with culture. It's the same thing with a lot of things around the world. And so again, going back to Questlove, oh, Thriller. It's just like, no, everyone doesn't look at art in the same way. Cuba looked at art as a means to serve the revolution. And if Thriller wasn't serving the revolution, then it's just like, what are you doing with it? I'm just saying, again, I love MJ, but come on. Like Chuck D said, I love MJ, but he said Nike. But wait a minute. Come on, y'all. Come on. So getting to what you were talking about in terms of the psyops and the filming and everything, this is what's happening with Cuba, where they're actually taking photos from Miami and saying it's in Cuba. I'm like, are you serious? Who has a Trump hat in Cuba? Who has a Make America Great Again? I can't even say it. Who has that hat in Cuba? Who has a Police Lives Matter flag in Cuba? Why are y'all telling people this is in Cuba? And why are y'all posing big this sis? Julio, July 26th. Y'all got a July 26th flag all up in that piece and saying this is an anti-government demonstration. Y'all know what July 26th is? July 26th is the day that the Revolutionary Army fought against the Batista regime. And y'all are saying that this is an anti-communist protest with a July 26th flag all up. Like, y'all got to do better work than that, capitalism. Like, y'all failing for real. Like, come on. July 26th? Anybody who studies the revolution knows what significance that day has. But if you haven't studied it, you'd be like, oh, it's like January 6th. Like, it's like people saying September 11th. Now everybody knows what January 6th is. Like, you just say the day, everybody knows what that is. But all up in DC, somebody had a Vietnamese flag. Like y'all are really up there trying to deceive people. Like, people are smarter than that, but So then I want to say this too, because there's people, they film in these videos in Miami and saying that it's in Cuba. So people literally, I'm going to read some quotes. So people are out here, they're saying, we're going to attack the hotels, the stores, the police station. So people in Miami are saying this, and they're on video saying this, and their location's there. The police cars that you can knock out, give them fire, and also puncture their tires. So this is just like the cops throwing Molotov cocktails in the stores and saying, it's the Black Bloc or whoever did it. That's exactly what this is. These two dudes are like varaderos. So Varadero is, it's east of Havana. And so it's a resort town. And it's also called Playa Azul, so blue beach. And so it says varaderos, get into all the hotels giving bullets, destroy it, to loot it all with bottles, with bright light, or with oil, or whatever you can get, with Molotovs, metrones, or locks. So I don't know, I mean, throw the locks or to lock up places to make it look like the government is shutting everything down. I don't know what he meant by that. And he said, and throw them at night. We are going to block the streets. We are going to take out the garbage tanks. We are going to turn them outside. And so here's another one. They were talking about Camagüey. So Camagüey is Taino land. This is indigenous land that got taken over by the Spaniards. And so which I think this fake news about Camagüey being taken over is really pivotal, because this is indigenous, as all of it's indigenous land, but they said Camagüey. So they had all this news and people were reporting it, like Camagüey has been taken over. It's been found out to be fake. So again, if you're not following up or following news sources that really are on the ground, you're going to be deceived by this stuff. So then there's a man with a bulletproof vest in Miami saying this, because you who are sitting at home right now, maybe what you need is a spark to go out and make videos as a result of this video. See the motivation that you have. The person who sees your video and sees you in the street will be motivated and then make a chain of action. There are more than 80 people. More is the purpose of entering Cuba and provoke the world that the right people have to see things and see we are not playing. See that we want to change for freedom for Cuba, because we do not want them to stay in politics, because we do not want months to go by and time goes by and Diaz-Canel is still there with his policies. So again, this is an ideological war against the people's class. So this is exactly what this is. And there are people from Miami making these videos and writing these posts and using bots to spread misinformation. And we have to really, really dissect all of what's going on here, because we can't have people like Questlove sitting on that cultural war hill, because there's a real ideological war going on. And there are people in Miami saying, oh, y'all need to have people go over there and do this. And then it's doing the cops' work. So it's like, we got to really pay attention to what's going on and stop focusing on simply culture, because they're literally saying, oh, y'all gonna go over there and change the government, even though that's not what the people want. The majority of people out there are like, we support the revolution. But what you're seeing in the capitalist media is where you're seeing like 30 people out there, and they're in Miami. And if you want to talk about the Mario boat lifts, and this was all people who's either were in the lumpen proletariat class, or people who emigrated based on class interests. So a lot of people came to Miami, and that's as much as Scarface I think is a bad movie, I think that was a perfect example of that, because they showed the clip of Castro, which is like, okay, like y'all want the people, give them to you, and it was a whole criminal class in Miami. So it's like, first you get the power, then you'll get the money, then you'll get the women, all of this. And so yeah, it's just like, if you don't understand what side these people are on, you're going to end up being against the people, and you're not even going to be aware of that. So study the history of the revolutions around the world before you make that mistake of sitting and dying on a hill, which is anti-people, anti-masses, anti-people's class.
Exactly. There has to be a deep study of what's happening, and it reminds me of another point that I've seen news stories post pictures of marches of the rallies that are for the revolution in Cuba, and it's like, well, these anti-Castro revolution, like, one, Castro's not in power, Castro's not the president or secretary general. Two, these are people who are supporting of the revolution of the people's class. And three, just take a few minutes, just study the photo, just study the photos, just talk to people. And that's funny about this. And I even saw another one where they took a photo of, it looks like a Afro-Cuban woman who she's got the Cuban flag, and it's saying that, oh, this is a angry protester against the Cubans, and she's like, no, and even she went on Twitter, it's like, no, I support the revolution. Like, what are you doing? Like, stop using me.
Exactly, that's the same thing that happened with Elian Gonzalez. And the funny thing is with that coverage, because they're showing footage of Diaz-Canel go in the streets and engage with people. And they're like, I'm hungry, we don't have lights or whatever. It's just like, we're doing what we can. And what president in the US does that except for when they're on the campaign trail? You do not see any president going to people in the streets being like, oh, y'all don't got lights, let's help you out. Well, look what happened. Chavez, Venezuela, okay? They went to working class communities. People in Harlem was like, thanks, Venezuela. But I thought the US was the wealthiest country in the world, but can't even help people with electricity. Can't even help people with food. So yeah, Africans instinctively know that the Cuban Revolution is the right thing. Africans instinctively know, because there's a historical analysis behind it. There's a historical alliance. Africa, even Nelson Mandela, when he was, who was that, Ted Koppel? Because they were like, so why are you supporting the Cubans? Why are you supporting the PLO? He's just like, y'all expect y'all enemy to be our enemy? Like, we don't roll like that. Like, if it wasn't for the Cubans, we wouldn't be in the position we are today with the end of apartheid. The Cubans was rolling up in Angola. They were part of the liberation struggle in Africa. So this is where Africans see it. And so for the US to think that just because y'all see Cuba is the enemy, that we supposed to, and people today who are African who see Cuba as the enemy need to really rethink their relationship with the US. The US, everyone's like, why are police shooting us? Why this, why that, redlining, all this. And yet you still like, oh, Cuba, man, like, man, they don't like us. I'm like, are you kidding? Like, in what world is this? Cuba has been on the front lines in the African struggle, and you saying that Cuba was just like, yeah, we'll send you assistance with Katrina. Like, y'all really out here saying that Cubans don't like us and they racist? Like, y'all really, like, that's another hill y'all want to die on? Really? Africans know the struggle is just somehow, some have gotten lost along the way, but Africans instinctively know. And I really love what Kwame Ture talked about. He's like, Fidel Castro is one of the greatest Pan-Africanists we know. Like, what are you talking about? So, you know, and we could say the same thing with anyone who is on the front lines of the struggle for African liberation. So get out of here talking about oh, they was racist. And people want to talk about Che being racist because he said like one thing. I'm like, I'm sure that you've said a few things too that were anti-African. Are you against your own people? Well, what did the actions of Che Guevara say? We can struggle over those words all day, but what did his actions represent? And that is what we need to focus on. What were the actions of the Cuban Revolution? What were the actions of the Revolutionary Army in the front lines of the African struggle? And that is what we need to focus on. So anyone being like, well, they racist and, you know, they Latinos and not like, no, no, that's not the hill that you want to die on. And I'm apparently saying that a lot today, but there's a lot of hills that people apparently do want to die on, and it shouldn't be happening. We love you. Come home. Come home. You don't want to die on that hill. You don't want to sit on that hill like Lauren as the rain falls down and pouring. You don't want to sit on that hill. Only Lauren gets to sit on that one, but, or anyone else named Hill, I guess, but you don't want to sit on that pro-imperialist, pro-capitalist hill, especially as someone who's colonized. I mean, even as someone who is descendant of colonizers shouldn't want to either, but especially if you are a colonized person in this world, that is not the hill you want to sit on. And I will keep saying that in this episode.
Exactly. Oh, and speaking of which, it might, you talk about racism in Cuba and stuff, even as far as I know, they also acknowledge it's been hundreds of years of enslavement, of colonization, of like imperialism, neocolonialism. Like racism is not going to disappear in a year. It's not going to disappear. Yeah, it's not going to disappear in 60 years. And yeah, like they have, like there are issues with like whether like the amount of care necessity for indigenous and Africans, and people like this understanding of it, this critiques of that. And I know we talked about this a little bit before our recording of some Cuban anarchists who came by a few years ago when I was working with anarchist comrades at the base. They were talking about, there's some issues with like the organizing issues with LGBTQ work, and whether like the extent that it was like how far they were able to take some of the things they were saying and actually apply it to what was happening on the ground. There's talk about some issues with the environment, and like there's always like reasonable critiques that have like anywhere, whether you talk about socialist nations or anti-imperialist nations or just like any nation, any place, there's always, like we say, there are always contradictions somewhere that is reasonable critique. And even though they had these constructive criticism, they themselves were also saying that blockade's got to go. and so it's like dismissing, like, saying it's all just a blockade, it's not that big a deal, or that doesn't explain this and this. And like, but like if you like, you have to understand like how big of a deal it is that, one, in spite of the blockade, that they have been able to as well as they've done for expanding like economic democracy, expanding healthcare, education, literacy, and so on. And some of the issues that come with the blockade have to do with how, even though they were able to create vaccines, they were not able to get all the supplies, because guess what? Some of the supplies they can't make because of the corona lockdowns and so on. So you have stuff that happened with corona, the lockdowns, and the blockade. That definitely like has some issues. So again, you have to understand where there's a point where understand that there are some positives and negatives. Like, okay, we can talk about this all at once. And then once you get to that point, what are you gonna do? What's going to know?
Right. And there's actually the WikiLeaks cables. I mean, there's a ton of those that came out that discuss the power outages that the CIA purposely planned to destabilize the government, the cities in Venezuela. And So of course that's come up in relation to what's happening in Cuba. And so to say that this is not an ideological war, like the US doesn't do anything like that, or the acronymed organizations don't do anything like that simply because of culture. They do it in order to make sure that people do not have provisions. So they look to the US as heroes. It's like, well, we're starving. What can we do? US, help us. That's exactly the whole point. To simply go, well, the Cubans aren't doing anything. Or here's the one, oh, how come Chavez is hoarding all the oil? I'm sure you've heard that one. It's like, well, the reason why you cannot process oil is because you don't have the facilities to do that. And the places which were doing trade no longer either were not able to do trade, or they were prevented from doing so. So how can you refine anything without the ability to refine anything? So you have to think about the nature of a blockade and an embargo. The purpose of an embargo is to starve the people to serve a political and ideological purpose. So if the CIA is totally coming in and saying, what's a way we can starve the people? So then it looks like their government is doing horrible. Let's make sure the electricity is not able to come on. Hey, let's make sure the grocery stores are empty. Let's make sure we do this, that, or the other. Or we could just kidnap the president. We could do that too. That way there's real destabilization. I mean, there's a lot, they did it with Allende. They did it. There's so many situations. Again, let's get into Haiti now, since we're talking about, how the CIA and the US is involved in destabilizing governments. So there are definitely just info purposes there. Do you remember when Wyclef Jean did that anti-Aristide film? You remember that?
Oh, that I don't remember.
Oh yeah, he did this. So they had this whole campaign that Aristide was not mentally well and he was not suited to lead a nation, and because he was a part of the whole liberation theology. And so a lot of people obviously, as we even saw here, that liberation theology is not exactly favored upon even with capitalism. So with liberation theology, it's just like, okay, we're going to feed the people. And so much of it is rooted in the African liberation struggle. So it's just like, okay, we're going to feed the people. We're going to make sure that people have houses, this and that. And so Aristide was on that. And we're like, oh, he's not going to be an agent for us. So we got to do something. We'll have this info campaign. And I wish I could remember the name of it right now, but Wyclef did this movie, which is bad mouthing Aristide. And anybody remembers that, please write it down. And I'm sure I'll find it after this episode. But yeah, so he was part of that. And so a lot of people were like, oh, is he an agent? Is he trying to be president? There was a whole rumor that he was vying for the presidential role. And then he had that song, If I Was President, so I don't think that helped. But I think he also had a relative that was in the Clinton administration, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a lot of connections there. And a lot of these disinfo campaigns, what came out of, the news here, again, he was unstable. He was unstable. He couldn't take care of his people. And then twice they sent him to Africa, which that was me. I'd be like, I'm home. But, this is a very different situation where he was a president of a country that was democratically elected twice. And they were like, oh no. So what did they do? They got rid and put Martelly in. And they were like, okay. But because of the term limits that were in the Haitian Constitution, he couldn't go beyond that. And so they were like, okay, well, I'll get my dude in, so we'll keep it going. And it's just like, okay, but the people don't want the dude. So, okay, but now, okay, here's the situation that now he has been assassinated. So Moise has been assassinated, which was the dude, Marty won it. It's just like people are like, well, did the US have to do with it? But there definitely were some DEA ties. That's very clear because he had, connections with the DEA. And if there was no US connections there, and he had DEA ties, they wouldn't let him do what he was doing. But to say that the US came in and did that, I don't know. I mean, I definitely got US support under that government, but I agree with the people on the ground in Haiti that it was an inside job. I'm going to defer to the people on the ground and not, as you were saying, I'm not there. So I don't, but I think if you have a presidential suite and you have security there and people can come in and, they weren't like, who are you? So obviously it was somebody who knew him. It was somebody either tied to the government or tied to one of the drug gangs or something. And they were just allowed to go in there. And so he and his wife were shot. And he ended up succumbing from that. And so now with we need you again saying we need US assistance, UN assistance. And so here we go again. This is against the people's will. You had the whole Clinton situation, and then you had the natural disaster that went over there. The UN came in, and then what came out of that, there were like rapes, assaults, etc. that came out of that. And it's like, and then people again, because of all these situations, are like, yo, we need asylum. But Clinton, Obama, no. So you had, in a lot of ways, the color revolution, but then you had disinformation. But all of this, again, people are like, well, it's a complex situation. It can be, but if you're looking at the connection with US imperialism, if you're looking at the history against the People's Revolution, which was 19th century, and then you have the 20th, 21st century, all people struggle all the time, and the involvement from the US empire to prevent it, and from Europe to prevent it. How is this any different? I just, again, I'm struggling to see how people are seeing this different than what happens in the US empire to the people who live here. Like, what exactly is the difference?
And brings up another point about like what regards to media and color revolutions, that as we talked about they were Africans in Haiti. They were protesting against the Moise neocolonial government for years, and you'll hear a little bit here and there. You might have heard something like when like early in February when they were supposed to leave office, but they said, "Oh, I have another year." And like, no, that's not it. And like you hear a little bit like, and that was like, and that's a clear point of like going against the people's wishes. But you don't hear anything. You don't hear like this outrage of like, oh, this president said he's a president, but he shouldn't be. He says he's here for another year, and anything about that. Again, you'll hear.
But before you, so why can't people see the similarities between that? But everybody sees, oh, Trump. Everybody's like, oh, Trump. Oh, January 6th. Oh, he's past the term. He can't get another term. But people cannot see what's happening in Haiti with Moise doing the same exact thing. Your term is up, buddy. Get out. but we need U.S. intervention. The same thing is that you don't think the U.S. supported that? Because the people cannot have a democratically elected government. So they want to keep their people in. And why didn't Moise just like bring one of his dudes in? Instead of being like, no, I'm deserving of a term, like my term is not up based on some loophole he thought existed, which it didn't. But why didn't he just do what Martelly did? But there are parallels between the Trump thing and Moise, and people do not see that. And maybe they do, but I haven't even heard mention of this parallel.
And going back to Martelly, that the discussion of how, like, when they're doing the 2 rounds for the presidential election, like 2010, like again, there was issue where I think it was someone from Family Lab, either Family Lavalas or a related party. They were supposed to, from the results, like, oh, they were going to move to the 2nd round, but all of a sudden, like, Martinez getting all these votes, and all of a sudden, like, interesting. and then you have the fact that that he had ties with the Duvaliers. So that's so funny. Like the Duvalier, like someone can have ties with the Duvaliers, like these dictators, and these people who are like standing against, like they representing the bit large landowners and so on, and getting all this supposedly aid from the U.S. But anyone who supports, it marginally supports like the Cuban Revolution or the Haitian Revolution, like speaking about that, then that's somehow anathema. So like it's funny how free speech works, or like what can be spoken or what can be said in the so-called free society.
Right, and McCarthyism still exists in one form or another in this country. You have COINTELPRO, you have Patriot Act, you have the omnibus crime bills that exist. All of these bills turning into law still exist. And yet people are like, well, we have to protect democracy and free speech somewhere else. You gotta deal with it here. People are still at ideological war. For the fact that they have a domestic extremist list, once again, that's under the Biden administration now. You don't think that's a war against the people ideologically? So to be like, oh, we just need to honor freedom, and women aren't allowed to do this and that and the other in this country. That still exists here. You got to deal with that here. So I think there's one thing to support the masses of the people's struggle on one level, but to support what the oppressor or the enemy says as the people struggle, you gotta make that distinction. And too many people are not making that fine line and thinking that a struggle is a struggle is a struggle. Like SOS Cuba, are you kidding me? Really? If Marco Rubio is saying SOS Cuba, you should never be repeating SOS Cuba if you want to be on the right side of history and justice.
Yeah, that's why I call him Marco Rubio. Like, it'll be SOS Cuba, but anything about Colombia and its colonial state, all the hundreds and hundreds killed and tortured and beaten up by the police forces there, against austerity measures, against all these measures, but you don't hear again. That's another part. You don't hear all the stuff about that. And now, one thing I want to talk about, like we talk about okay, you know all this, like you don't talk about color revolution, you talk about Alfred, but okay, then if I want to see like what might be a color revolution, like how can someone tell? So one thing we want to talk about, like what are some of the people or organizations that could be at least a hint that something little fishy is going on.
Well, one of them was mentioned anything that is titled the National Endowment for Democracy. Yeah, beware of that one. Obviously CIA, FBI, APOC, oh, other organizations would be, well, okay. Oh, let's actually discuss this one, the Open Society Institute, because a lot of right-wing people are like, George Soros funded BLM. It's just like, okay, so the Open Society Institute gives money to a lot of organizations, be like, well, we'll throw some money at you here, there, and the other. And it's like, okay, people's movement, I guess, here and there. But to say, the fact that an individual in very rare situations throws money at any sort of mass organizing, it's nonprofit or NGOs, which usually throw money at organizations and in turn ends up dictating how some of those organizations get run. But what happened with BLM is you have the National Foundation, because they were like, well, we're not really a national foundation. But there were tons of chapters, BLM chapters around the world that open up and are doing on the ground work. So to say that George Soros is funding those chapters would be absolutely wrong. But yes, the Open Society Institute, which George Soros is a part of, yes, that is factually correct. But we have to be really specific when we say things like that, because again, you're falling into this trap by being absolutist and not understanding nuances of things, and it's speaking against people's movements. And that is its very purpose, to use this statement, George Soros funded this. It's like, that doesn't mean anything. What does that even mean? And when you ask people that, they can't even say, well, you should know. So yeah, we gotta be careful when we see people saying stuff like that as well.
Another point is when you hear people talk about George Soros trying to run the one world communist government. He runs Antifa. He runs George Soros is a billionaire, and do you think a billionaire is in any interest to having his wealth and land ownership or whatever? Yeah, I think he has any interest in having that seized for the masses of people? No. And it's to look at his history. One of the things that he did is I think in Thailand, he did something with regards to part of his wealth comes from working with currency, currency of values and such. And one of the things that in Thailand, I think he was trying to get the government to devalue their currency, and they made a large windfall of it. Again, not something that shouts the elimination of all classes and that doesn't speak anything about class, any sort of class struggle, except I got some more bling, And see, as we talk about how a lot of the color revolutions came about from the post-Soviet area, and which, if you actually look at the history of the Soviet Union, there was not the mass of people actually want to keep it together, but their voices got denied. So again, that's a separate thing. But again, a lot of the work done in any of these after the Cold War was involved with quote unquote democracy movements, and a lot of them they were done not out of any kind of respect for people. It's out of making sure that those places that sort of close themselves off a little bit, aside from trading with either other socialist nations or with non-aligned nations, can be open to the magic of the free market. That's basically what he's been doing. So to say he's trying to institute some kind of world communism is false as heck. He's just trying to spread the magic of global capitalism, if anything. So and again, and as Jamilah said, it's not something that's only Soros only, or you say, let's talk about Bill Gates, only Bill Gates or only Elon Musk or something. It's like the class interest of certain people to say they want their things to take control over what the mass of people want. So, and again, when people talk about Soros, is that in that case, like, yeah, there are right wingers who do it as some kind of like anti-Jewish sentiment, like Jews like to do like the sort of like the all-seeing Jewish person who controls everything. Like again, that's like immaterial, and that's like false consciousness right there, and just wrong. But to somehow think, I guess sometimes see people say, oh, I got my Soros bucks, I got this, but again, but they're doing, but again, places like, or it's like the Open Society Institute, or you see USAID, or the U.S. Agency of National Development, or National Democratic Institute, International Republican Institute, and it was the NED, National Endowment for Democracy. Like if there ties to people and those, or like either they got some kind of grant, or they went to some university and they got some grant from something like that, or they worked with some organization, then it's a good thing that they're, if not actively trying to co-opt a movement, they're certainly trying to steer it in some way. So those are some of the things to look up. And as far as the general,
well, yeah, there's Voice of America, which somehow, even though it's called Voice of America, they have news covering Africa, Asia. It's like, Voice of America. Let's think about the Voice of America, not even the Americas. It's Voice of America, covering international news, by the way. And when they talk about was it CNN or World News Report or whatever, it covers the US, but you have Voice of America covering the rest of the world. You gotta love it. I just just wanted to say that.
and again, and it's still around, even though like Voice of America, or people have heard of Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, even though it might not be the case as much now, but certainly if you're getting news again from those out, like they're like even people who don't, like even people who might rail against people saying, oh, it's not just CIA, CIA is not everything, blah blah. Like even in that case, like they're open and like yeah we're like if you see those YouTube bars that we've seen in the last like couple of years, where they, like, if there's something from a news station, it'll say like, oh, this, like if it's like from BBC, it's like it's publicly funded, or from some other from the United States, it's publicly funded. But if it's like Russia, it's like, oh, it's paid by the Russian government, or it's by the Chinese government, or this. But the thing is, if you go to something with Voice America, even then they'll still say this is paid by the U.S. government. Like even then, they're open about the fact that this is like a propaganda piece for the state interests. So, and if there's stuff from there, then again, they're probably doing something fishy.
It makes me think of when they were trying to promote Guaido in the U.S. and there's the footage of Guaido going into one of the hoods, and there were people that crowded his car and they were like, get out of here, you're not our president. Like, of course that wasn't on Voice of America, of course that wasn't on NPR, of course that wasn't, on Fox or CNN. So something like that, you have to get a lot of the news on the ground from the people. And I think that's one of the benefits of social media. So of course, because the US owns a lot of these companies or either internet companies or Wi-Fi, like they distribute around the world, but they still have ownership of these companies. And because of access to Wi-Fi or lack thereof, the masses cannot always distribute that information, but there's always that one person that can get it out. So you got to look for. There's somebody who's like, oh, my cousin's in Guatemala right now. I may live in Texas where, they send me that stuff and I'm going to distribute it. So that's the stuff you got to look for. That footage where people are like, you are not our president. Or again, if you have that eye, like you got to make sure you don't see that July 26th flag up on Fox News. Cause y'all got to do better. But yeah, there was a connection with what was called CTU Security LLC, and that came out of Miami. And so there is a connection. They're saying that CTU Security is tied to the assassination of Moise, but they also are tied to the attacks on Maduro in Venezuela. So I think it's important to look a little more into that as well, because there's that US connection and the class interests that are tied in destabilizing democratically elected governments and making sure the will of the people is brought down. But you cannot, especially with places like Cuba, you cannot bring down the will of the people because they did all of that work since 59. You think that's gonna go away just because you have an embargo? People, they do political education. They have military training. They have some of the best doctors in the world. Are you kidding me? There's an Air Force Brigade. I mean, are you kidding me? There's so much collaboration around the world, alliances around the world, 194 countries that are like back off of Cuba. The world is seeing what's going on. You think that, this little news story on Fox News is gonna stop the revolution? Really? Like people, again, y'all have to recognize that people around the world have a relationship to US imperialism that is not a positive one. So people know, we see what's going on in Cuba. Oh, no, we don't support that. Hands off Cuba. There is a relationship that people understand. And it's about time people in the belly of the beast understand that, especially if you're like, our tax dollars are going to this. Okay, if your tax dollars are going to that, why you not saying back off Cuba? How come you talking about Thriller albums and stuff like that? Like, you go, they arrested. It's like, but yeah, you're like, my tax dollars going to that. Like, your tax dollars are going to stealing Palestine. Like, that's what you need to focus on. North America is still stealing land from indigenous people, whether it's through NAFTA, whether it's through the schools that Canada put up with indigenous people still looking for indigenous people breed. Like, like enslavement of African people has happened, and the US still hasn't properly dealt with that. The genocide of indigenous peoples, the US still hasn't dealt with that. And y'all talking about a culture war. Like, y'all got to deal with here. This is not our home, but we still got to deal with these issues because Africans are here. Indigenous folks are here. So we got to deal with that because Africa's got to be liberated, but that, like, we can't, obviously Africa is primary to us, but Africans also understand. It's like, oh, y'all, like, okay, y'all can't go home right now. Like, okay, we gonna help you in this struggle. So look what happened. Everyone's like, Black Lives Matter all around the world. And what's the focus on that? The US, because people, again, have a relationship to US imperialism that is not positive. So they understand what the police are doing because the police are doing the same thing wherever Africans are everywhere else. So we gotta deal with these issues here too. But yes, also understand that Africa's primary. We're African people, but we can't separate the Africans in the US from the Africans in Cuba. That struggle for liberation that happens in Cuba should also be happening here because we are African. So to just look at it like, well, people are starving or cultural. No, like, I'm gonna say it one more time. That is not a hill we need to be dying on right now. We can't be doing that. So everyone study history. Study what happened with the Cuban Revolution and why the revolution needed to happen. And study it from the people on the ground, not people whose class interest were not for the revolution. You should study that too, so you have both sides and you're able to make an educated decision on why the revolution was important. Don't just study on a side you agree with, like, because you're not going to get the full picture. But what I am saying is, if you're just like, well, people in Miami, they're Cuban, they're saying something needs to happen. It's like, then you're not studying the whole picture of why they're against the revolution. You said, well, my friend is Cuban. Like, that's all you got? Like, so yeah, like, don't focus on the culture war that's happening, because culture is a big part of how the war against the people is used. US aid is a huge component of that. NED, National Endowment for Democracy. Those are two major ways that the war against the people in Cuba is used. They use hip hop, y'all. They use hip hop from US aid to go against the revolution. They use people, oh, Castro bad, whatever. I mean, that the US aid has a huge history about how hip hop is used. Like, even if you want to talk about how culture is used against the people, you can just go there. So we can't just believe what these people say. They're straight up saying, go and do the work of the cops. Go to Cuba and do the work of the cops. They're literally saying this on video. This has come out of their mouths. So, you can believe whatever you want, but like, there's actual facts happening. So the other thing in terms of Florida, roofs are caving in. Did y'all not see roofs caving in, whole buildings caving in? Land is unstable in Florida. So y'all need to deal with the codes that aren't being dealt with, the building codes that are not being properly dealt with. Like, I mean, I'm sure there are some folks who were Cubans who, are affected by that. So y'all need to deal with that as well. And stop trying to do the work of the cops in Cuba and be like, well, we need to just destroy cars. It's just like, okay, so you're against your own people. You talking about your people starving, but you going to be like, well, we going to do this. So you anti-Cuban. It's like people, you're a bad Jew or whatever. It's just like, okay, but if you're Zionist, you're against your own people. It's just the same thing. So you're talking about destabilizing what the majority of the people are for is a revolution because you don't like it, and the minority of people's class interests are anti-People's Party and anti-revolution. You want to go and make sure your people continue to starve. Okay, good luck with that. But the people's revolution is going to win. The people's revolution is going to continue no matter what you do.
And another point is it gets back to like defining what violence is. Like, what's violence? And I guess another point as far as some of the things to watch out for color revolutions. They wanted the people that, like, I'm not sure if he's the guy, but certainly someone who wrote about some of the tactics that have been used for these color revolutions. Gene Sharp has two books. One from the 70s called The Politics of Nonviolent Action. One from around 2012 from Dictatorship to Democracy. So again, those speak about some of the tactics that have been used in various color revolutions. And another thing is that, like, if you might have seen from other episodes how what some of our work is with like trying to get the revolutionary intelligentsia as part of our party. And that's something that those like NGOs and organizations have done to take students who like they're like understandably frustrated with what's happening, and use that in a way that's either for like some narrow interest or for counter-revolutionary matters. And one major example is what happened was called the bulldozer revolution in Serbia, or was in the what's called what was then called Yugoslavia, for what was left of Yugoslavia, against Slobodan Milosevic. And they had like various like slogans. But the one was, I think I'm hoping correctly, called A-APRP, which is just like basically like some slogans like, hey, like Slobodan must go, or like, and one of the main actors for that. Let me see if I can get his name. It's the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So long story, like this, like the whole like history of Yugoslavia. Like, we could go on about that, but like and there's a pretty decent documentary called The Weight of Chains, which talks about the history of Yugoslavia and the subsequent breakup of it, and how there was they basically, like, it's basically again like a point of imperialism. They were willing to tolerate like the socialist government in Yugoslavia because they didn't take a fully like antagonistic point of view towards the snakes. But then once the Cold won the Cold War, then it's like, we don't need you anymore. Let's start a little trouble here. It's like people of different ethnic groups living together, peacefully, not necessarily peacefully, but certainly they're able to work together and like cooperate and so on. But student leaders from that, he had worked with the NED. and some further and other color revolutions, they had help from some of the people involved with A-APRP. So, and again, and as we talk about, as Jamila was talking about, that is to think that, it's happening abroad. I don't care about foreign policy. I just care about what's happening domestically. Well, as a great ancestor, Malcolm X, Miguel Shabazz said, chickens do come home to roost. Just saying. So don't think that just because they're doing these things in some nation, some country, that you think, they have a dictatorship, they have art. Just because they're doing it there doesn't mean they're not. I mean, I think if you're, as we said earlier, if you're a militant of some guy in the snakes and you're doing some work, let's think of some of the tactics they're doing. Like, they're doing some of the tactics to like co-opt your thing. So yeah, so it's always helpful to understand that what they're doing abroad is connected to what's happening here. It's not to think that these are separate spheres is a mistake. Like, capitalism is near total. So a lot of things that could connect to capitalism, like the fact that you're on, like as we say, if the fact you're on a computer, you're on a phone, you're tied to someone. You're tied to someone in on the continent who's digging up some of the minerals to make this work. You're tied to people who are building the microchips, or building the processes and building the machines, and of course you're tied to the person who worked at the store or like at some Amazon, or you worked at Best Buy or something, who's getting underpaid there. So, and whose worth is built upon those other people's. So again, just because it's up 1,000 miles away, and again, it's like always helpful to know what's on the ground. But if you don't fully know, you're still tied no matter what. Like even someone as a pro-capitalist, pro-free market as Milton Friedman understood that. Like he pointed out, like the making of a pencil, like a lot of people took a lot of work to make that pencil. To think it's just you could just somehow separate it from yourself is just ridiculous. So.
Friedman, Keynes, it's sort of using capitalism to build the people. It's just like, well, capitalism be capitalism. So I don't know, but there are a lot of Keynesian people who are like, well, I'm on the side of socialism, but also think, like Keynes, Friedman, they're all right because we're in a capitalist world, and it's like, no. That's a whole other conversation.
And not to mention Friedman and Pinochet and the Chicago boys.
Yes. And then even now that you say that, it's funny because we could look at Lula, who, you know, he was part of the labor movement. He was unions or whatever, but just the relationship to Brazil's support of the intervention in Haiti. It's like, no, what are you doing, Lula? You understand people struggle at some level. Why would you? So yeah, now I think he's running again. So it's just like, oh yeah, you got to deal with that one. Especially like the Haiti issue, I'm sure is going to come up for you. So, but yeah, I did when you said that, it just made me think of that.
And you just made me think of something else. When you talk about Lula and his work, his union work, like labor work, is that like again like one, so especially for sort of quote unquote classic left, is about the work about unions and the role in the struggle, revolution, so on. And again, and that's another point. Like with these color revolutions, like sometimes there are unions involved, or like trade unions involved in these struggles. And again, like obviously we're not saying don't organize work or against work or however you want to do. But it's not, again, we're not saying don't do it, but understand that like you understand there are unions here that take some reactionary steps and or collaborate with the state. Like obviously, like I was a big one being like police unions. Like that's the obvious example. But even outside of that, there's a trade organization that has ties with the CIA that were there to fight against revolutionary unions. So to fight for a provincial conservative unions to like counteract some of the radical unions. And again, like, just because of strikes doesn't necessarily mean they're somehow doing it to like seize the means of production, or even simply like get better wages or connect to workers elsewhere. They might just be doing so because like they can see some of the unions like after NAFTA that like understand that the free trade agreements do affect like the workers, so either losing jobs or losing income and so forth. But they're more concerned with they take it from a more nationalist, like reactionary nationalist point of view of these Mexicans, they're taking our jobs, or these Chinese taking our jobs, or these Hondurans, these Filipinos, and so on. It's something to look for, that even with regards when you have groups that they might say, oh, we're a union, or it's a left party, or so. That's again, you have to understand what's the dynamics there too.
Yeah, and you also had me thinking about color revolutions and student movements, and one of the protests that was major news when we were both coming up was Tiananmen Square. US news was all over that. And it's funny because I had even then sort of a burgeoning anti-capitalist analysis. It obviously wasn't fine-tuned, but I was hearing from different spaces how that was a color revolution then. And I wasn't like, no, but it made me think, oh, there was actually people saying that this was funded by the US or supported by the US. And it led me at some point to look into that. And with that, they focused on the students being like, we want democracy, but there was also a workers' strike at the same time on that same day. Why do you think that was not a focus?
I think again, big reason why that's not a focus is because I think like, even now, like some of the if you watch some of the corporate news talk about unions, whether it's teachers unions, whether it's retail unions, or like even like domestically, you hear about unions. Funny enough, not police unions, they're cool, but you talk about those that are involved with like production and consumption and so forth. They at best they take both sides. Well, this side wants this, or the union wants this. The the owners or want that, and or at worst they sort of like they say, oh, this union already gets all these benefits. Why do they need more? Or I think the reason is that they don't want any sort of challenge to their station. Like if they know that there are workers who are saying, oh yeah, like stuff has to change, then that means that's challenging some of the same ownership who's owning those newspapers, who's owning those television stations, media, so forth. Like, and I think sort of like why, and it's like if you think recently, like we'll definitely have an episode about labor and workers and so at some point. So watch out for that. With regards to the mostly African workers in the southern United States who are fighting Amazon, think of how big of a push there was to how they pushed Amazon and say like law firms and so to try to like stop their organizing, and sadly they did. But again, that doesn't mean like the fight's over. But again, there's always as we talk about the propaganda aspect of the United States, that how much labor history, how much the effort of organizing people is sort of either suppressed or warped. So they'll focus so much about students because students, they'll tend to have a little more of a different, obviously not every student's going to be wealthy, but again, there's a bit more of a class character there. Like, students, they might be future managers, they might be future CEOs, they might be or so forth. So if they focus on students, then it's like you see this now with all the whole political correctness. So like talk, you hear a lot of that because they're like, all these students, they might run things. They're gonna do diversity trainings on you or something like that. So that they are worried about that. But as far as like the people who are getting their food, the people who take care of their children, people who getting the food for their farms or doing other sorts of work, that, and you get into that, you get into, or the people who are trying to organize their buildings, or like you're getting into places where they're kind of scared. And I think if you, and going back to China, like one of, like even now, like this discussions about China, like, oh, is it socialist, is it social imperialist, is it capitalist? Like even then, like there isn't much of a discussion about how there like contradictions and discussions of what's happening in China. It's just, Mao killed 18 billion people, or they just taking over Africa. They're trying to listen in on us. They're trying to do, but no discussion of what the Chinese Revolution did. Like a billion, over like hundreds of millions, like billion people fought against that's like long history, like fight all the dynasties, and then became a republic, and then fought off, and then on the Communist Revolution. Like funny enough, you read some of the early revolutions also have some anarchists fought as well. But again, like you don't think how there's such a bill, millions and billions of people to fight against all these landlords and such, and not to mention like Japanese occupation and China getting taken over and from being colonized, and the opium and so forth, and go from that to having like hundreds of million people who just are able to have control over their land, the resources, and so forth. And like ever since then, it's like if you talk about like the actual like root of it, instead of just going just democracy against some dictatorship, if you just leave it at that, then you can't really think how some of the things that happen in China relate to like people elsewhere. And I think they try to do it in such a way to sort of like simplify it and not give people ideas.
Yeah, did you actually hear about Just again, you made me think of something. There's the Lay's strike that's happening right now in the US. And so shops are like, due to labor issues, we will not be having our full capacity of Lay's products. And Lay's is also a corporation which has ties to Israel. Speaking of Israel, Ben and Jerry's recently built a facility on a settlement. So there's two companies, but Ben and Jerry's recently built a facility on, they bulldozed parts of Palestine, and then they're building corporations over it. So yeah, that's two things. I have one more question for you though. Oh yeah. See, we could get, as you're saying, we could get into a whole conversation about labor, but so getting back to the disconnect, because again, here people understand the role of capitalism and how it does lead to discontent in one way or another. So the murders by the state, the inequities economically, the housing inequities, the educational inequities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when Diaz-Canel calls on communists and revolutionaries to keep up the fight, people somehow like, well, communism bad, it doesn't work. It doesn't, like, obviously people died, as you mentioned, under communism. And people, again, they keep showing the footage of people in the streets going up to Diaz-Canel and being like, we're hungry, we have no electricity. And he's just like, oh, okay, I understand that, we're doing what we can. And Diaz-Canel also openly recognizes that the situation, the conditions that people in Cuba are facing right now is because of the blockade. But somehow that piece is getting missed by folks even on the left. So, and there's that connection to capitalism, being like, oh yeah, I know there's so much wrong with capitalism here. And with Biden saying, oh, I'm a capitalist, but it's crony capitalism that's exploitative. And everyone's like, let me correct that for you, Biden. It's capitalism that's exploitative. So people can say that all day, but somehow when Diaz-Canel or anyone else is like, well, communism, that is an objective to reach. Oh no. So if you understand that capitalism is the problem and is the root of a lot of the problems in the US and of course around the world, what do people on the left, why do you think they have an issue with communism or even social, like not democratic socialism, but actual socialism and revolutionary? Why do you think people have that issue?
I think again, there's a sort of idea of, obviously it depends on what ideology someone follows, that somehow the quote unquote that form of like Soviet socialism, it didn't work, it killed people, it made people to perform, it did this and that. Like we understand that. And speaking of which, we should have an episode about socialism too. So again, watch for that. Again, I think again it's from this thought that I think especially for people in Western, people who like grown up in Western capitalist societies, they get a lot of ideas of that there is only one type of socialism, or like the socialism that did exist is somehow so worthless, or so like they just like the power, the people who want to like get rid of the capitalists and so on, they become the new dictators, or they become just as corrupt and so on. And I think it eliminates that sort of dialectical materialist understanding of like honestly we can't just go back and do what the Bolsheviks did, or do what the Communist Party of China did, or time of Vietnam, or 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 even like talking about Africa, like we can't just go back and do what the MPLA did, or Conventional People's Party, or PDG, or so on. Like or ZANU. So again, obviously we can't just take what they do and copy and paste it to now. But at the same time, it's sort of like this myth that I know I talk about Parenti a lot, but again, he points out these movements, it worked for a lot of people. It did work. Like, were there issues? Yes. they even people with like leadership, like they understand, like, oh, maybe we shouldn't suppress certain cultures as much, or maybe we should have like opened up a little, or should have done this, or like yeah, like again, like obviously there are certain issues there, and like if like for someone who's serious as a historian in general, or someone who's a revolutionary specifically, they understand there were issues, but at the same time, like to think that it's somehow something you should escape from, that doesn't make sense. Like again, like if you have a different ideology and you think maybe you could do something totally different and work for people, okay, let's go for it. And again, like there are different ways it was applied, and depending on where it was, it worked better for some places than others. Some people it might have worked a little longer, or certain classes, or one of the books that I read about patriarch accumulation on a little scale, maybe it didn't fully deal with the issue of gender fully, or places might not have done as well with on like certain nations, or done well with land, or control of class issues and so on. But yeah, I think this one thing is that sort of like binary thinking that, okay, we don't have sort of the socialist nations of like during the whole war, therefore it's failure, and we can't look at anything good from them, which I think is ridiculous. Like we could always learn. They did some good. We should understand that some things that now we can do even better now that could work. So again, I think it's an issue of it's kind of an interesting bit of like we're supposed to look at nuance for these color revolutions and say, well, if you look at people on the ground, some will say they don't have problems, but if you say, like the Cultural Revolution, like it was necessary, or some of the things Stalin did wasn't that bad, or Mozambique and Angola, or Ghana, Guinea, so forth. Like they've helped a lot of Africans, but you say, no, those are dictators. No. Again, I just think that, like, again, it's weird. Like, what point? Sort of a weird bit of like when nuance applies and when it doesn't.
Yes, and so I have two things to say to that. Two questions for anyone who says, capitalism and communism and all this. A, do you want a dictatorship of the proletariat, the masses of the people, if you're going to use that word, or do you want dictatorship of a handful of people who own the means of production and you just have to keep working for them in order for them to profit? Do you want one or the other, or would you prefer one or the other? The other thing I would ask is, if you think socialism didn't work or never works, how do you think it's going to work if an oppressive system keeps getting in its way in order to not even thrive? So that's the question I would ask. Like, you got this whole system getting in the way for it to even like go anywhere. So of course it's not going to succeed if something's always in the way. So those are two questions I would ask people, like, wow, socialism just never worked. And A, you would need to have the whole world be socialist in order for it to work, honestly. Like, you can have some places, it's like Kwame Nkrumah said, yeah, Ghana, we're not free until all of Africa is free. So it's the same thing. You could have, you could have Cuba. And so that's a model we could look at it, be like, okay, this is what we should strive towards. But clearly there's contradictions and issues there because a blockade is in the way. So Cuba's not even allowed to fully thrive in a way that it could if there was no embargo, if there was no blockade. So even that is an example. So we need to ask ourselves these questions. How can anything having to do with liberation succeed if something's always in the way to try to prevent that? So please, next time you even try to have that come out your mouth, ask yourself those questions. You got any final words for this episode?
Yeah. And to follow along, and follow along the bit about socialism and how it didn't happen, or either did not, or reduce the chances of succeeding. What about capitalism? Like, capitalism didn't just come up it didn't just come out the air and like, oh, free markets and wage labor and this and accumulation and all. Like, if that didn't, like, if you think about, like, for example, the French Revolution, like think of how long, like, France had to get, think of how many different empires and republics had to go through just to get to, like, become France and do this. And or you think about the United States and what they had to go through, and think about like UK and like other, like, it's not like the monarchy. It's not like the monarchs or the landlords were just like looking at these merchants and saying, oh, you want to use this? You want to, like, pay people for this land and, like, freely? How awful! like it's not like they somehow just let the bourgeoisie just usurp them. It's not like that. It just happened. They just let them go. So do you think any other system is going? Do you think the capitalists are going to let the other system just go? Oh, we want to take over your power. You think that's going to happen? No. So.
Yeah, and with that, the fact that people celebrate to this day, people celebrate Bastille Day, people celebrate the U.S. getting established because a bunch of people came from Britain to get away from the monarchy. So those days are celebrated all day, every day, but you can't even honor a Cuban revolution. Like, again, and the last thing I'm gonna say is, that's not the hill y'all want to die on. It's just not. It's just not. So, on that note, stay tuned for future episodes. Please go back to other episodes we've done. Please join an organization. If these conversations mean anything to you, the gift that you would send to us is if you join an organization. Like, you sitting here saying we love what you're talking about, that's great and everything, but the gift to us would be to join an organization for liberation of the people. Please, we beg of you, because the revolution is not going to be done by itself. Liberation is not going to be done by itself. It's going to be sitting over there until we actually take action and move towards getting it. So that's what y'all got to do, because you're like, I love freedom. No, but we do too. That's why we're organizing. So join an organization for liberation. It doesn't have to be the A-APRP. Whatever organization that you seek, please join it, as long as it is for the people's revolution, as long as it is for any sort of people's party. It is not for the anti-people's party. That's all we ask of you. And we have some podcasts, other podcasts, some programs that we constantly talk about here. So there's the Pantsula Podcast, of course, but we have the Revolutionary African Women Podcast, which is a couple of our comrades. They do it once a month, Saturdays. I think it's the final Saturdays. Please, if I get that wrong, I apologize. I think it's the final Saturdays of the month. And then we have our comrades, Ajamu and Chikura. So they do a presentation every week, just like we do. So they are always doing this work. Ajamu has recruited me in this organization, and I am forever grateful to that. So I'm just saying, like, we're all here doing the work, and part of this is programmatic to spread the news to you, to encourage you to join an organization. So what are our other podcasts that we have, Evan?
We also have the We also have the Forward Ever podcast of from people from the social media task force out on the west coast of the snake. Also, there's Sister Ayasawu doing the Pan African Weekly News on Thursdays out in the occupied New Mexico, occupied Tiwa territory. And again, listen to the podcast, and that's great. Read the stuff, read the articles, the books of stuff from the party. That's great. Again, if you're concerned about some of these organizations who are doing all this color revolution, you understand this history either before or you're just learning about it now. Again, go join an organization to make sure that it's fighting for the people against those forces who are trying to co-opt the liberation and do it just for imperial powers. So it makes it even more important to understand, like, how do you fight these people? How do you fight the NED, USA, so forth, who are trying to do this stuff? Out-organize them, take them, so that they try to do stuff, then they're out of luck, basically.
Yes. And just to show that we're not sitting here in our bubbles and we're actually working together and collaborating, I actually was this past week, was on the New Mexico chapter's Tiwa territory, the chapter's podcast, and we were talking about patriarchy. So comrades Onyesamu and Monica. So it was lovely. I don't know. I was just like, oh my goodness, I'm so nervous, but I did. and of course, Ajamu has been on this podcast. Our comrade Onyesamu will be on soon. And so we're all working together to make sure our objective of Pan-Africanism is achieved. And we're doing it ideologically. We're doing it in person with people. We're doing it through various means. We also have Pan-African Women's Day coming up on July 31st. It is going to be a worldwide program. So we will post the link in description. So please join that. Please register now so you can just watch and take in the anti-patriarchy through this work, because it is important. So please, everyone, just join an organization. It is of utmost importance. Time is of the essence. Please join an organization for the people's struggle for liberation. Forward ever, backwards never.
Forward.